In the year 1260, the world held its breath. For more than 4 decades, the Mongol hordes under Genghis Khan and his successors had swept across Asia and Eastern Europe like an unstoppable storm of steel and fire. City after city fell, empires crumbled, and entire civilizations were reduced to ash. Baghdad, the glittering jewel of the Islamic world, had been sacked only 2 years earlier in 1258. Its caliph was trampled to death beneath Mongol horses, and the Tigris ran black with the ink of 1,000,000 destroyed books. The Mongols seemed invincible, an apocalyptic force that no army could stand against. Yet on the morning of September 3, 1260, in a narrow valley called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, in northern Palestine, that myth of invincibility was about to be shattered forever. 20,000 Mamluk warriors, slave soldiers of the Egyptian Sultanate, faced a Mongol army led by the feared general Kitbuqa Noyan. The Mongols were outnumbered, overextended, and far from home. The Mamluks were fighting for their very existence. What followed would be the first decisive defeat ever inflicted on the Mongol armies in open battle, and it would change the course of history. To understand how this miracle happened, we must first go back and trace the terrifying rise of the Mongol war machine and the desperate circumstances that forced 2 extraordinary men, Sultan Qutuz and his brilliant commander Baybars, to gamble everything on one throw of the dice. The Mongols were not merely conquerors. They were a revolution in warfare. Their armies were built on mobility, discipline, and terror. Every warrior was a horse archer from childhood, capable of loosing arrows with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed. Their composite bows could kill at 300 yards. Their ponies could march 70 miles a day on little food or water. They traveled light, lived off the land, and used sophisticated signaling systems, flags, whistles, and burning arrows to coordinate vast armies across dozens of miles. Under Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis, this machine had turned west after the conquest of China and Central Asia. In 1256, the assassins' mountain fortresses in Persia were crushed one by one. In 1258, Baghdad fell after a siege of only 13 days. Hulagu's armies then swept into Syria. Aleppo was stormed in 6 days. Its citadel held for another month before being razed. Damascus, the ancient city of the Umayyads, surrendered without a fight. The Christian princes of Antioch and Tripoli sent tribute. Even the distant Crusader states in Acre paid homage, terrified of what was coming next. Egypt, the richest and most powerful remaining Muslim state, was next on the list. Hulagu demanded submission from the young Mamluk Sultan in Cairo. But in early 1260, fate intervened. Word arrived from the distant Mongolian capital of Karakorum. The great Khan Munka was dead. Hulagu, as a prince of the blood, took the bulk of his army, perhaps as many as 8 tumans or 80,000 men, and marched east to press his claim in the inevitable succession struggle. He left his trusted Lieutenant Kitbuqa in command in Syria with a much smaller force. Estimates range from 10,000 to 20,000 warriors, perhaps only 1 or 2 tumans. This was the moment the Mamluks had been waiting for. The Mamluks themselves were a phenomenon almost as extraordinary as the Mongols. They were military slaves, mostly Kipchak Turks and Circassians bought as boys, converted to Islam and trained to become the finest heavy cavalry in the world. Freed upon reaching adulthood, they formed a warrior caste that had seized power in Egypt after the death of the last Ayyubid Sultan in 1250. Ruthless, disciplined, and utterly loyal to each other rather than to any dynasty, they were professional soldiers in an age of feudal levies. Their leader in 1260 was Sultan Qutuz, a man of iron will who had murdered his predecessor to take the throne only months earlier. Qutuz understood that if Egypt fell, Islam itself might disappear from the Middle East. When Hulagu's envoys arrived in Cairo demanding submission, Qutuz had them publicly beheaded in the city square, an act of defiance that sent shockwaves across the Islamic world. But Qutuz knew he could not win alone. His greatest asset was a 30-year-old Mamluk officer named Rukn al-Din Baybars, already a legend for his courage and cunning. Baybars had escaped Mongol captivity as a boy, fought the Crusaders at Mansoura in 1250, and was said to hunt lions with a spear for sport. The 2 men, one the Sultan, the other his subordinate, made an uneasy alliance. Qutuz promised Baybars the governorship of Aleppo if they won. Baybars, for his part, brought genius to the battlefield. In July 1260, the Mamluk army, 20,000 strong, marched out of Cairo toward Gaza. They moved fast, using the coastal route through Crusader territory. In a stroke of diplomatic brilliance, Qutuz negotiated with the Franks of Acre for free passage and even purchased supplies from them. The Crusaders, hating the Mongols more than the Muslims at that moment, agreed. By late August, the Mamluks had crossed into Palestine and were advancing north. Kitbuqa, informed of their approach, gathered his forces near the springs of Ain Jalut. He was confident. His men were the veterans who had destroyed Baghdad. They still believed themselves invincible. They were wrong. The terrain around Ain Jalut would decide everything. The valley lay east of Mount Gilboa, flanked by low hills covered in scrub and olive trees. A small stream fed the spring that gave the place its name. To the north and east, the ground rose gently toward the Galilee highlands. To the west, the hills of Samaria created a natural funnel. It was perfect ambush country. Qutuz and Baybars arrived first. For days their scouts shadowed the Mongol patrols, feeding false reports that the Mamluk army was still far to the south. Kitbuqa believed he had time. He dispersed part of his army to forage and terrorize the countryside, standard Mongol practice to live off the land and spread panic. On the night of September 2nd, the Mongol main body camped carelessly in the open plain near the spring, confident that no army would dare attack them head-on. They did not know Baybars was already in position. The Mamluk plan was audacious and perfectly suited to their strengths. The bulk of the army, perhaps 15,000 men under Qutuz himself, concealed itself in the hills to the east, behind a ridge that hid them completely from Mongol view. A smaller vanguard of around 4,000 to 5,000 elite cavalry commanded by Baybars in person would advance at dawn into the valley. Their job was simple and suicidal: lure the Mongols into pursuit, draw them into the killing ground, then retreat in apparent panic. When the Mongols followed, exactly as their doctrine demanded, the hidden Mamluk host would slam shut the trap. At first light on September 3rd, the drums sounded. Baybars' vanguard appeared on the western edge of the plain, banners flying, horses snorting in the cool morning air. Mongol scouts galloped back with the news. Kitbuqa wasted no time. He formed his tumans into the classic Mongol hunting ring formation and advanced, believing he faced only a fraction of the enemy. The first clash was brutal and brief. Baybars charged, exchanged a furious volley of arrows, then wheeled and fled eastward, straight toward the hills where Qutuz waited. The Mongols took the bait completely. Shouting their war cries, they thundered after the fleeing Mamluks, heavy cavalry in the center, light horse archers spreading wide on the flanks to envelop what they thought was a broken enemy. As Baybars' men crested the low ridge and vanished down the reverse slope, the earth itself seemed to explode. 15,000 Mamluk heavy cavalry burst from concealment at full gallop. Lances lowered, armor gleaming in the rising sun, they smashed into the Mongol left flank like an iron tsunami. At the same moment, Baybars' retreating vanguard executed a perfect caracole turn. The famous feigned retreat reversed and slammed into the Mongol vanguard from the front. Kitbuqa's army was suddenly caught in a double envelopment, exactly the tactic the Mongols themselves had used to destroy countless enemies. The fighting now became a slaughterhouse. Mamluk chroniclers later wrote that the clash was so violent that the sound of swords on armor drowned out the screams of the dying. The Mongols, for all their skill, had never faced an enemy that matched them in horsemanship and surpassed them in armor and close combat ferocity. The Mamluks wore mail hauberks reinforced with steel plates. Their horses were barded in iron scales. Mongol arrows, deadly against lighter troops, often failed to penetrate at close range. When the lines closed, the Mamluks' heavier swords and maces crushed skulls through helmets. Kitbuqa fought like a lion. Mounted on a black charger, he rallied his bodyguard again and again, trying to cut his way toward the Mamluk standards. Tradition says he killed 15 Mamluk emirs with his own hand before a thrown mace shattered his shoulder. Even then, he kept fighting until Baybars himself, recognizing the Nestorian Christian cross on Kitbuqa's banner, charged through the press and drove a lance through the Mongol general's chest. With Kitbuqa dead, Mongol resistance collapsed. Those who tried to flee westward ran into fresh Mamluk detachments that had circled behind during the night. By noon it was over. The plain of Ain Jalut was carpeted with Mongol dead. Some sources claim every single warrior in Kitbuqa's army perished, though more realistic estimates suggest at least 6,000 to 8,000 fell, with the rest scattered or captured. The Mamluks lost perhaps 1,000 men. It was one of the most lopsided victories in medieval military history. The psychological impact was immediate and irreversible. For the first time in living memory, a Mongol field army had been not merely checked, but annihilated. Captured Mongol officers were paraded through the streets of Damascus and Cairo, their top knots cut off, their proud lamellar armor stripped away. The message was unmistakable. The terror that had crushed Persia, Iraq, and Syria could itself be broken. Qutuz did not live to enjoy his triumph for long. While riding back toward Egypt in October 1260, still flushed with victory, he stopped to hunt hare near the Nile Delta. Baybars, who had been promised Aleppo but now suspected Qutuz would never relinquish real power, seized his moment. During the hunt, Baybars approached the Sultan, kissed his hand in the traditional gesture of loyalty, then drew a dagger and drove it into Qutuz's throat. Other emirs joined the murder. Within minutes, the victor of Ain Jalut lay dead in the dust. Baybars calmly mounted the blood-spattered throne and proclaimed himself Sultan. When the assembled Mamluk officers protested that any of them could have killed Qutuz, Baybars replied, "Yes, but which of you dared?" None challenged him further. The man who had orchestrated the destruction of the Mongol myth now ruled Egypt. Under Baybars, the victory at Ain Jalut became the foundation of a new imperial order. He drove the remaining Mongol garrisons out of Syria by 1261, recaptured Crusader strongholds one by one, and turned the Mamluk state into the dominant military power of the eastern Mediterranean. His spies and diplomats worked tirelessly to keep the Mongols divided, allying first with the Golden Horde against Hulagu's Ilkhanate, then switching sides when it suited him. The Mongol frontier in Syria stabilized along the Euphrates and never again seriously threatened Egypt. The ripple effects reshaped the 13th century world. In Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII watched with relief as the Mongol storm that had loomed over Anatolia for decades lost its fury. In the Crusader states, the Knights Templar and Hospitaller suddenly found themselves facing a confident and aggressive Mamluk Sultanate instead of the apocalyptic horsemen they had feared more. Acre would fall 31 years later, not to Mongols but to Baybars' successors. Most importantly, Ain Jalut saved Islamic civilization in the Middle East. Had the Mamluks lost, Cairo would have shared Baghdad's fate. Libraries burned, scholars slaughtered, irrigation canals destroyed. Instead, Egypt became the new center of Sunni learning and culture. Al-Azhar flourished. Arabic science and philosophy survived to influence the Renaissance centuries later. The battle also exposed the limits of Mongol power. Hulagu, furious at Kitbuqa's defeat, vowed revenge, but the civil war with his cousin Burqa of the Golden Horde drained his strength. The Ilkhanate converted to Islam in 1295 and eventually became just another Middle Eastern dynasty, more Persian than Mongol. The dream of a world empire stretching from the Pacific to the Mediterranean died forever on the blood-soaked grass of Ain Jalut. Today, the Spring of Goliath is a quiet place. Wheat fields cover the valley floor. The hills are dotted with Israeli and Palestinian villages. Few monuments mark the spot where 20,000 Mamluks turned back the tide of history. Yet every time we open a book of medieval Arabic poetry, study the mathematics of Al-Tusi, or admire the blue-tiled mosques of Cairo, we are standing in the long shadow of that September morning in 1260. The Mongols taught the world the meaning of fear. At Ain Jalut, the Mamluks taught the world that even the greatest fear can be defeated. This was the day the unstoppable horde was stopped forever. 20,000 Mamluks, men born into slavery yet masters of war, proved that courage, discipline, and brilliant leadership could break even the most terrifying military machine the world had ever seen. Qutuz gave his life for the gamble. Baybars claimed the crown with blood-stained hands and turned victory into empire. Ain Jalut did not merely save Egypt, it saved an entire civilization from annihilation. It drew a line in the sand that the Mongol tide could never cross again. From that morning onward, the myth of invincibility was dead, and the road to Cairo remained forever barred to the sons of the steppe. The world moved on, new conquerors rose, new empires fell, but the echo of lances shattering on the plain of Ain Jalut still rings through history. It reminds us that no force is truly unstoppable when men are willing to stand, to fight, and to sacrifice everything for the single defiant belief that some things are worth dying for. September 3rd, 1260, the Spring of Goliath, the day the horde learned fear.